Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming. I wish to welcome in the name of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, our guest speaker today, Dr. Anthony Faramelli. Anthony lectures in visual and cultural theory at Goldsmiths University of London. He's also a mental health recovery program consultant at the London Charity and a member of the Network for Institutional Analysis. His research is largely situated at the intersection of psychosocial theory, recent French philosophy, and post-colonial theory, with an explicit focus on social movements and issues of indigenous resistance. He is the author of Resistance, Revolution, and Fascism, Zapatismo, and Assemblage Politics, and an editor of the book called Spaces of Crisis and Critique, Heterotopias Beyond Foucault. Anthony is currently working on a monograph tentatively titled The Mass Psychology of Fascism in the Age of Machines, Big Data, Surveillance, and Control. Anthony, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I guess I'd like to start by thanking the institution, or the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory for inviting me, and especially thank Georgia Strajkovic for her enormous generosity. Really appreciate that. I'm really honored to be here today. I'm really honored to have been invited. And I'm quite proud to be here to stand kind of in solidarity with the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. I don't think it's an understatement to say that philosophy, social and critical theory, the humanities in general, are definitely experiencing a moment of attack. Maybe the most visible form of this attack was when Viktor Orbán's government in Hungary shut down gender studies. And if I recall it correctly, when they shut down the departments of gender studies, they said it was because it was teaching an ideology, not a science. And this perfectly positions the kind of assault that the humanities constantly face. You know, where as academics, we're always having to justify our reason for being. So what I want to do today is kind of outline some of the institutional strategies, you know, kind of deployed here, and think through a kind of politics of resistance that we as academics can formulate. So I'm going to try to speak as briefly as possible and then open it up to questions and discussion, just because I think that's where some of the most interesting conversation happens. But what I'm going to do, first I'm going to kind of outline what I see as the problems within institutional workings. And given where we're situated today, I'm going to specifically think about kind of pedagogical practice. And looking back at Gayatri Spivak's essay, Terror, A Speech After 9/11, where she understands teaching as the non-coercive rearrangement of desire. So that's something I want to take really serious and seriously think about how we do that. My analysis will draw heavily from my work in institutional analysis and Zapatismo. If you're not familiar with this, I wouldn't be surprised if you're not familiar with this. It's a little bit niche. But institutional analysis, broadly speaking, is a methodological approach developed by the institutional psychotherapy and institutional pedagogy movements in post-war France. The movements had some pretty notable figures like Frantz Fanon and Félix Guattari. However, very little work's been done on that. Zapatismo is a kind of politically informed, philosophically informed political praxis developed by the Zapatista resistance in Chiapas, Mexico. Now, I know that my research here and what I'm going to be drawing from is fairly niche, so I'll try to work through it as clearly as possible, and then hopefully anything that I wasn't clear about or any points that need elaboration on, we can get to that in the conversation. Sound good? All right. So to provide us with a wee bit of context, the attacks that the humanities are facing right now are in no way new. You know, for generations, at least, you know, the post-68 generation, but definitely before as well, the humanities, or academics in the humanities, have had this kind of dubious honor of being known as troublemakers, right? As such, you know, we've always had to kind of endure attacks on what we do. You know, what we do is not scientific enough, it's not grounded enough, you know, it's thought for the sake of thought. You know, so why is it then, you know, that we are always having to justify our positions, whereas other disciplines don't? You know, especially authoritarian governments. So what is it about the humanities that authoritarian governments seem to find especially problematic? What I would like to propose here, kind of tentatively, is that the humanities kind of represent a threat to authoritarian formations because within these disciplines, there's the potential to open up new horizons. Now, I really want to stress this. I'm not just here to celebrate the humanities. My critique of the humanities is as long as anyone. Nor do I want to say that other disciplines do not have that potential. They certainly do. And every humanities department does not open up horizons. You know, I personally have worked in way too many toxic environments to ever make that argument. However, the focus on critical theory and critical thought in the humanities, I think makes our disciplines rich for potentially constructiveness. So what do we mean by horizons? You know, the title of the series was Horizons of Engagement. You know, that's a really provocative title because horizons, you know, understood as this kind of vanishing point, right? That's always out of reach, but nevertheless, it's a real space. So because a horizon is always out of reach, you know, because it provides guidance and direction, but we can never quite reach it, it seems to necessitate a certain form of utopic thinking. But I think this is really weird. I don't think horizons should really necessitate utopic thinking because utopias are fictions, right? Sometimes necessary fictions, but fictions nevertheless. And horizons are real. So here I draw heavily, and this is, to be honest, probably the only time I ever draw heavily on Jodi Dean's work. So Dean situates horizons as absolutely real insofar as they exist spatially and they exist temporally, but they're an impossibility. So she quite productively draws on the Lacanian concept of the real to kind of explain how this is possible. And in her book, you know, Communist Horizon, she says that these horizons become these fixed, permanent entities that are there to provide guidance so long as we can see them, but they're always there, they're always fixed. And this is exactly where my reading of Dean kind of ends. I don't think of horizons necessarily as these kind of fixed totalities. I prefer to think of them through the Deleuze Guattarian concept of the virtual. So the virtual here is a space of possibilities. It's a real space, but it's a space where possibilities can exist. But the idea of the virtual, the idea of this space of possibility, is it has to be communally constructed. You know, it's not just a fixed entity that's always there. And here I think this is where we get to something that's a little bit more interesting, because for Deleuze and Guattari, these virtual spaces or horizons are always articulated through a communal enunciation of desire. So desire becomes the kind of key component here. And I do think that the humanities, at least when kind of done right, if we're going to put right in inverted commas there, are able to create the spaces needed to facilitate this kind of communal enunciation of desire. So if these spaces are about desire, then when we go back to Spivak's concept of teaching as the non-coercive rearrangement of desire, that's something that becomes a very provocative thought, right? Because how do we do this? So for Spivak, famously, this is done through the practice of deconstructive reading. But I don't think that reading alone is enough to get it. You know, even reading in the kind of Derridian tradition, you know, for as powerful as it is for as powerful as reading is and kind of locating and analyzing power formations, I don't think just reading within the deconstructive tradition is really what does it. There has to be something foregrounding that reading. And for me, it's about the construction of space. In fact, my work, I seem to have a certain kind of fixed, you know, obsession with the notion of space and how do we construct spaces. It's something that absolutely floats kind of floats through my work and something that I really want to think about today. Because I think, again, speaking to you as an educator, speaking to you as an academic, this is something that I think needs to be at the forefront of our thinking. Because when we construct this space, we allow students to enter it, you know, And through this communal iteration of desire, of what would be a new desire, they form what Deleuze and Guattari would refer to as a machinic assemblage, right? A war machine. So if you're not really familiar with Deleuze and Guattari, basically the notion of assemblage is where multiple kind of heterogeneous parts come together to work together in concert, but yet they retain their difference. So each point retains its difference. The war machine then is one that's, it's not like talking about state war or the body war, politics, anything like that, but it's basically a nomadic machine that's on a deterritorialized line of flight. It's something that's experimenting with new possibilities. I think is the best way to describe this. And that's really what we want to do in education. Education, when it's done right, is not about teaching, it's about creating the space that allows thought to happen. But since desire is such a key referent in what I'm talking about, I think it's probably a good point to step back a wee bit and talk about what do I mean by desire. Here, again, I draw from Deleuze and Guattari. A lot of my research is on Guattari specifically. But desire there is really explicit, and it's explicitly not psychoanalytic, right? We all, I'm sure most of us understand psychoanalytic desire. It's trapped within a circuit, it's defined by lack, and it's internal to the subject. We only have to think about Lacan's le petit object a. The kind of unescapable object of desire. Desire then always becomes a fantasy of the other, and what the other desires is entirely internal to the subject. Boring and dead concept. So what Deleuze and sorry if there's any Lacanians there. So what Deleuze and Guattari, they reformulate desire as something that's always heterogeneous to the subject and also constitutive of the subject. So the subject then is always formed in the wake of a communal desire. One way I always think about this is, just to date myself a little bit, during the 90s, during the kind of alt-globalization, anti-capitalist convergence movement, this was something that you always saw specific, right? So if you look back at what was happening in Seattle in '99, the way that the different protest groups were merging, this was a communal enunciation of desire. There was a strong anti-capitalist desire enunciated there. How we came to understand ourselves as subjects always came in the wake of these moments, of these events. So the desire in this case was something that was outside of us and flowed through us in a quite constitutive, constructive way. There we were thinking about how do we form new assemblages, how do we work in concert, even for brief periods of time. And in fact, I think that was what became important, is these moments of intensity were always temporary. So you're always defined by relations of intensity rather than a kind of unified total subject. So this is very much what I mean by desire, is this constitutive force that flows through us and forms us in the process. So then how do we rearrange this, in a non-coercive way? So I would argue that when students come to university, they come there on a specific line of flight, right? That, again, drawing from Deleuze and Guattari, a line of flight is this kind of deterritorialization, this radical moment of experimentation, right? Again, if you're not familiar with Deleuze and Guattari, you have this kind of notion, and this is super simplified, but you have this notion of the territory, and then there's the deterritorialization, which is this kind of radical moment of experimentation. And then that becomes subsumed within the social body through the process of reterritorialization. And that's how movement occurs. So students come to us on a line of flight, on a line of deterritorialization. But this is always a deterritorialization that's in relation to the institution. You cannot disassociate the institution from the experimentation. Institution here, kind of drawing on the French, is something that, at least in English, does not quite track. So in English, when we talk about what is an institution, it always is this kind of firm, fixed, brick and mortar, calcified building, right? The French, however, and I think this is closer in Serbian as well, an institution is really anything that institutes. In this case, institutes forms of sociality. So therefore, an institution is not just brick and mortar, or brick and mortar at all, really. It's a discursive set of relations that kind of dictate how we socialize. That they dictate how we relate to each other. Through this kind of discursive arrangement. A really super vulgar and oversimplified way to think about this is the way we relate to each other in this space is going to be very different than how we relate to each other in the pub later on. Just because there's different sets of relations that govern sociality, right? Again, that's a over vulgarization of it, but just to kind of get this as a framework in your head, I think it works. So then when students come to the institution helps. The institution's always moving with the line of flight, right? But in some ways, it's also what captures it and gives it grounding. Importantly, for Deleuze and Guattari, reterritorialization isn't necessarily a negative. A lot of these concepts are pretty much value neutral, right? It's just how movement happens. In some ways, reterritorialization is necessary because it grounds you, gives you perspective, and then allows for a new line of experimentation, right? The notion of an absolute deterritorialization, something that never stops, for them is pretty much an impossibility. It can happen in a certain virtual space, but never actually. So the institution is what reterritorializes these lines of flight. But then our question then is, how does it capture this? What mechanisms of capture are in place? Here, I really like the work of Jason Wallen. So there's a nice edited book called Deleuze and Education for People to Come, where he has a chapter there, education has to get a grip on life, where he comes to the notion of the molar institution. So the molar institution, and this is a quote from Jason Wallen, it's a social machine through which labor power and the socius as a whole is manufactured. So he's talking about schools. So schools, as a social machine through which labor power and the socius as a whole is manufactured, figures in the production of social territories that already anticipate a certain kind of people. And I think that's really important, that schools anticipate the kind of people. So the coordinates, the way in which they capture these lines of flight is done so in an anticipatory, I'm not sure if that's a word, anticipatory move. And what kind of people do they anticipate? Largely people biopolitically derived through state power, quite bluntly put. So the molar institution is one derived from state authority. It's one that in some ways is calcified. Molar in the Deleuze-Guattarian framework is kind of any large normative set of values, right? So the molar institution is one that captures the students and overcodes their desire within these normative frameworks. So I would argue this isn't absolutely a reconfiguration of desire, but it's coercive. So the molar institution is one that coercively rearranges desire. And this is always a violent act, right? There's always a violence here. It's a top-down approach to how desire becomes overcoded. How desire becomes read, in fact, as lack. How desire becomes read as absence. This is really the biggest problem I think we have in education today. The fact that as we're pushed to forms of standardization, we are increasingly surrendering to these apparatuses of capture. So, I can only speak from my own context, right? So I'm an academic based in the UK. I did my degrees in Prague and then did my graduate study in London. So really the Czech and the British context are what I have a good understanding of. But I think that there's a lot to be extrapolated, certainly from the conversations I've had in the last day. It seems you can also think about it here in Serbia. So what we've had in the UK since 2010, roughly, when the coalition, conservative Lib Dem party came to power, is a new standardization of education. We have new frameworks that we're kind of benchmarked against. So one of them is the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, and the other one is the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework. And these are these really, I mean, it's laughable if it wasn't so violent kind of things. So if you do good on your TEF, are you a gold star or are you a silver star? You know, it's all these kind of weird metrics for how they judge us. My personal favorite was with the TEF. The biggest metric is student satisfaction. So if students say, oh, you know, your library sucks, and then mark us down, then we get less money as well, which means our library will always be worse. So now you have all these institutions like trying to bribe students to give us good grades. Like one university I briefly taught at, which politically shall remain nameless, used to bribe students with pizza and beer during the surveys. And it's like, oh, come on, we can all do the surveys together. We have pizza and beer, you know, just to try to up the TEF scores, right? But this is absolutely perverse. You know, it's absolutely kind of falling in within this kind of molar framework. When I did my teaching training, so in the UK, when you're doing your PhD, you have to do this course. It's kind of a MA certificate in learning and teaching in higher education. And just to show how kind of clever kind of neoliberal governmentality is, they drew heavily on that classic text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then they used that in the most brutal capitalist way you can possibly imagine, right? So they gave us all these kind of buzzwords. We're like, what kind of teacher are you? Are you the scribe on the side or the sage on the stage? And we had these like, so we have Judy and John. Judy's a good student. John's not a good student. How do you teach? You know, and all these kind of weird things that try to reconfigure how we teach, or trying to configure rather how we're going to approach the classroom in order to meet these metrics. And sadly, I've seen many departments that 10 years ago were quite radical, absolutely fall into these frameworks, you know, just as a way of kind of securitizing themselves. And in many ways, that's understandable, you know. I don't want to attack these departments for trying to securitize their position in what is, you know, a kind of prolonged assault on us as a discipline. However, you know, and in many ways, by securitizing themselves in these ways, they're also signing their own death warrant. You know, they're very much saying, in a way, we are unproductive. You're right, we should be more scientific. You're right, we are useless. Because by subscribing to these metrics that already prefigure us as useless, all they're doing is killing themselves. And it's for this reason, in a very specific way, that the molar institutions are very much dead. And I mean that both figuratively as well as literally. They're dead institutions. They're dead insofar as they're just a simulacra. You know, they're a simulation of a simulation of a simulation, the eternal return of the same, that does nothing but capture normative codes. You know, it's nothing but a simulation. There's no vitalist energy there. There's no creativity. There's no heterogeneity. You know, it's calcified. It's also dead in a very literal way. So since 2010 to now, suicide rates at universities has skyrocketed. The most famous case is the University of Bristol, where from one year to the next, student suicide increased by 150%. In my own department, which is better than the average in terms of suicide, which is already a horrible metric to think about, we average 1.25 suicides a year over the last 4 years. That's student and lecturer. And that's just in my department. There is 100% a crisis of mental health throughout the universities, at least, you know, again, speaking about the UK, where suicide rates are exponentially growing and we're not talking about it. And I think that this is an exact, you know, kind of effect of the molar institution, the way that it's foreclosing on our desire. When I say that these are dead spaces, I mean this in the most literal way, and there's an urgency to addressing this. Which kind of brings me back to the notion of resistance. How, as academics working in these institutions, do we formulate a resistant strategy? Because if we don't, I think we're basically killing ourselves. You know, we're just waiting, you know, just another lemur to jump off the cliff, right? We need to think collectively about how do we resist this. So to go back to this notion of horizons, right? If what we do, or what we should do, you know, a kind of something to work towards is constructing these spaces of potential, then what we're talking about constructing really is heterotopic spaces within the classroom. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this term before, but if you're not familiar with it, a heterotopia is something proposed by Foucault in a 1966 talk he gave called Of Other Spaces, Utopias and Heterotopias. So first he thinks about what are utopias, right? Utopias are these fictions, you know, spaces where we are not. But heterotopias, and this is what Foucault is interested in, are real spaces. They're real spaces that are inverted or counter sites. Famously, Foucault was primarily interested in what he referred to as heterotopias of deviation, prisons, asylums. But, and this is what I think is so interesting about this really brief and at times a bit rambling paper that he gave, is that he also opened this up to think about spaces of resistance. You know, he talked about, for example, a ship, you know, as a space where you can quite literally sail away from normative codes and have a kind of experimentation before re-territorializing it in a very kind of Deleuze Guattarian language, right? He also talked about the mirror as the perfect example of a heterotopia, where you can see yourself in a space where you're not, but nevertheless you're there. So the mirror becomes really important here because it gives you space for reflection and space for thought. And as such, it becomes a resistant heterotopia, you know, because it gives you the space to kind of critically assess what's going on. You know, this is something that other people like Edward Soya quite productively drew on in his concept of third space. You know, where third space is something that's opened up partly by moments of crisis, something which Foucault also notes, that crisis is a key term here. So when crisis opens up these spaces, what we have to do then is, rather than respond in the kind of same accelerated temporality, is slow down. And slow down and kind of lean into these heterotopic spaces to assess what we're doing and think about how new possibilities can form. So this is something that I think is done really interestingly in two specific ways, and that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. The first is institutional analysis, and the second is zapatismo, specifically the Escuelita. Escuelita is the little Zapatista school of freedom that they run every year. So first to talk about institutional analysis. I'm just going to go off text anyways. So to give you a bit of history, you had two kind of post-war movements happening in France that were related but yet a little bit different. So on one hand, you had institutional pedagogy. So that was started by this French kind of radical educator named Freinet, Cécile Freinet. And Freinet, a lot of his work had to do with writing, specifically communal writing. So he worked in primary schools and secondary schools. And what he did is he had every student of the year co-author textbooks for the year following them. And then the textbooks every year would be built upon by that year. So the students then were saying, this is what's important for you to know, this is what's not important. And it became this kind of communal practice where they're co-constructing knowledge. Which was absolutely amazing, right? And absolutely revolutionized how secondary education was taught in France. This was picked up in a quite significant way by two people, Fernand Uri and Ada Vasquez. Fernand Uri, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more, he was this kind of radical, resistant fighter, educator. And his younger brother he sadly passed away recently, a few years ago, Jean Uri. So Jean Uri enters into the story in a really interesting way. During the war, there is this Catalonian psychoanalyst, psychiatrist named François Tosquet. François Tosquet was fighting in the Spanish Civil War. He was this kind of anarcho-Marxist. And then when the fascists won, he ended up in a refugee center in Western France. He showed up in the refugee center famously with two books. One was Lacan's PhD thesis, where he quite famously argued that psychoanalysts should treat psychosis. And the other was Hermann Hesse's book on institutionalization. So as soon as he got to the refugee center, he started reorganizing the refugee center as a therapeutic community. And it was just really kind of phenomenological way of working. He was also an avid reader of Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology in general. So it was just kind of radical moment where he would be talking to people who are what we would now say have PTSD. And it's like, all right, well, now you're a nurse. You know, now we're going to do this. And how can we reorganize this refugee center? So he created quite a buzz around himself during this time. On the other side of the country, in this little village, Saint-Alban, you had the psychiatric hospital, and Lucien Bonafé was the director. Lucien Bonafé heard of Tosquet by reputation and pulled him out of the refugee center and sent him over to the hospital to work. This happened just before Nazi occupation. So during occupation, in this psychiatric hospital, Tosquet and Bonafé worked really just kind of making things up as they go. They always described it as a phenomenological way of working. You know, experience always leads theory. And they transformed the hospital into a staging area for the resistance, into a sanctuary for artists. So famously, a lot of the surrealist artists who couldn't get out of France ended up living there, like Tristan Tzara, for example, lived in the hospital for the duration of the war. They ran a resistance newspaper out of the hospital. Resistance fighters smuggled through there. And the way that they did this so productively was by opening the hospital up to the village. What's really interesting, during occupation, quite famously, over 80% of psychiatric patients died. Either they were exterminated or they died from starvation. Saint-Alban is the only hospital where no one died. So what they were doing was quite radical and quite revolutionary. Shortly after the war ended, François Tosquet became the director and took on two junior doctors. One was Frantz Fanon, the other was Jean Uri, Fernand Uri's younger brother. It was at this time when Fanon, Tosquet, Bonafé, and Uri somewhat formalized what they had been doing and came up with this notion of institutional psychotherapy. So the idea then with institutional psychotherapy is that the institution, the hospital, is a microcosm of society, and the hospital is sick. So in order to treat our patients, we have to first treat the institution. We can't cure our patients until we cure our institution. During this time, one of Fernand Uri's young students was this militant Trotskyite student, was interested in psychoanalysis. His name was Félix Guattari. So Fernand Uri was like, oh, my brother's doing this thing, you should go there for a summer internship. So you had this really crazy moment. I mean, this is just the kind of geeking out about French intellectual history. But you had this really crazy moment where Fanon, Guattari, and Uri were all at the same place at the same time working together. Fanon famously goes off, briefly went to Normandy and then went to Algeria, where he kind of became what we know of today as Fanon. But what's really important is for all of Frantz Fanon's work in Algeria, his decolonial politics, his resistance politics, he was always first and foremost a doctor. And he was always engaged in institutional psychotherapy. He continued to write articles about institutional psychotherapy all the way through his time in Tunisia, when he was working in the Hospital Charles Nicolle and set up the first day center in Africa. Jean Uri worked at a couple other hospitals after leaving Saint-Alban, and then came into a small inheritance and bought a villa south of Paris labor. So he started the clinic labor, and he brought on Deleuze and Guattari to work there, along with Jean-Claude Pollock and others. And they formed a network, the Institutional Psychotherapy Network, that worked very much in concert with institutional pedagogy. But there's a way that I think we can think of these two movements as working in concert that really needs to be thought of. So institutional pedagogy, that was very contextualized within the classroom. How can we have students communally work together to produce something new? So it was very much about a kind of revolution within the classroom, but always set within the classroom setting. Institutional psychotherapy, in many ways, broadened this and started thinking about how do we heal the entire hospital. So what's the process of healing the hospital from the inside out? And this is really interesting. So you have, quite famously, anti-psychiatry. And anti-psychiatry just wants to step outside of the institution and smash it, right? Or you have, like in the art world, institutional critique, where you stand outside of the institution and kind of read its riot act, but always from an external position. The idea with institutional pedagogy or institutional analysis is you situate yourself within the institution and try to create space within the institution so the institution can heal itself. Later, a young intern, Anne Kieran, joined Labor, and then became one of the key organizers in the movement of March 22nd during the May 68 uprising. And after May 68, her and Guattari took a lot of these practices and they formed, well, first they formed this Federation of Study for Institutional Life, Pedagogy. And then within Pedagogy was a large umbrella group for another organization, CERFI, the Center for Study of Institutional Life. CERFI took all these practices and moved it into the field of sociology, anthropology, the arts. By working, they'd get these kind of government grants, and then they would go and situate themselves within different institutional settings, work with the people to think about how the institution can be transformed from the inside. So they're very much there internal to that, as part of that. And it became this moment of radical experimentation, radical opening. At one point, it's even funny, Guattari in the 80s started kind of trying to distance himself from all this, just because it became really popular in France. Because they were working constantly on government funds, and Guattari, being Guattari, was like, no, I'm not doing this, I have to do something more edgy, although he always stayed engaged in it. And it looked like institutional analysis as a program, institutional psychotherapy as a movement, was gaining traction right up until moments of austerity. That really kind of foreclosed a lot of these possibilities. Foreclosed a lot of the or kind of cut off a lot of the possibilities, but didn't kill the movement. Labor is still functioning, and there's still a kind of network of people throughout France, engaged in these practices. So again, kind of politically, part of a lot of my work and the work of the network of institutional analysis, of which I'm a part, is trying to kind of reinvigorate this and think about how do we situate ourselves within institutions to transform it. To give another really interesting notion of grounding, quite different from this, but I think in very many ways in conversation, is the escuelita. So, do you all know much about the Zapatistas? So, I'm biased. I grew up at the Mexican border, spent a lot of time in Mexico, so I have a bias, but everyone should go read about the Zapatistas. In my mind, they're the most interesting thing happening in the last 30 years, if not more. So, again, just to give you a really brief history, the Zapatistas formed as a kind of 1984 was a key date, right? So you had 6 people, 3 indigenous, 3 mestizos, going from Mexico City to the jungle in Chiapas, the Lacandon jungle. And they did so in a kind of very traditional kind of Trotskyite Lenin way, where they're going to go and they're going to situate themselves as a guerrilla folky, and they're going to revolutionize, teach the poor, stupid indigenous people how to do revolution properly, give them a revolutionary consciousness, and then launch a revolution against the Mexican state, right? And in their writings, they always say the Zapatistas had their first military defeat in 1984 when they first got there. And they said it was a complete defeat, an absolute catastrophe of a defeat. They were destroyed. And they're destroyed by the indigenous populations that didn't give a fuck. You know, like had no interest in white folk from Mexico City showing up and telling them how to do a revolution. So then they were like, okay, shit, how do we reform all this? You can never get through a talk without swearing. So then they had to start forming what to date is one of the most interesting political philosophies that I've ever encountered. And they just kind of really happily take from everything, right? So one of the revolutionaries who became known as Marcos, now known as Galeano, we know before going into the jungle, he was a philosophy professor. Specifically, he worked on Althusser and Foucault. So when you read Zapatismo, you see these traces. You see traces of Gramsci. You see traces of Nietzsche, a lot of Nietzsche, in fact. You see traces of Spinoza. You see Althusser. You see all of this. But then this is kind of put into conversation with indigenous Mayan forms of direct democracy, direct participation, a certain kind of Mayan cosmology, but again, read through a kind of Nietzschean, Spinozaist framework. And what they've developed is something that, using the vocabulary of Guattari, would be a meta-model. That is to say, it's like an overlay. It's not a map, right? It's not like a set of instructions to be dogmatically followed, but it's, I mean, for lack of a better term, it's a horizon. You know, it's a space for possibility. You know, and they're always explicit, like what we do in Chiapas cannot be translated elsewhere. We have very specific conditions here that allow for this to happen. But how can we take these experiences and think about this as a horizon of thought and translate it elsewhere? So since, you know, 1994 is when they had their first public uprising. 94 was the day that NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed into law. It was a movement that was meant to make Mexico fully integrated within the kind of neoliberal system. So that's the day that the Zapatistas chose as their public uprising. So they attacked and took over 6 municipalities in the state of Chiapas, including the capital, San Cristobal de las Casas, and they held this space. But then they did something really perverse, right? They had a military advantage, but then instead of pressing the advantage, like military theorists would say you should do, they pulled back. They said, we have no desire to take power, we want to create space. We need to create space for dialogue. We need to create space for conversation. We need to create space where actual democracy can exist, not the democracy of what they refer to as the dead Mexico. You know, and this started a conversation and started creating space in the jungle. 1995, a year later, they hosted their first international gathering of humanity against neoliberalism. They didn't think a lot of people were going to show up. Thousands did. And it was a chance for different resistance to come and share experiences and think about how they can form new networks of solidarity. 96, they had their intergalactic gathering because they said that they felt as though they were being prejudiced. What if there's extraterrestrials? There's always a lot of humor there. Gathering, but every year they have these gatherings. 2006 then marked a kind of key moment where they decided that any negotiation with the Mexican state was pointless, so they're just going to live as if they won and just take this land and say we are now autonomous. So they quite literally just flipped the script in the jungle and started just living as if they had won, as if neoliberalism was no longer a thing. Since then, they continue to grow. They just announced this year another expansion with several new municipal centers opening. It's hard to get exact estimates, but if you count communities that are not explicitly Zapatista, but yet use Zapatista municipal services, kind of subscribed to what they refer to as the Sixth Declaration, so the kind of affiliate satellite communities in Chiapas. About 80% of Chiapas is Zapatista territory, which is ridiculous. You know, that a massive chunk of North America is Zapatista. And part of what they've been doing now for 5 years now, is they run every year the escuelita. Escuelita means little school. So the escuelita is run in different Zapatista communities, I think mainly in La Viedad. And they invite resistance from around the world to come to school. And it's the school for humanity against neoliberalism. But the entire idea is they, again, much like what Frenet was doing, every year they co-construct textbooks. So they're writing textbooks together, you know, based on what the school decides over this kind of 2-week period. And they start thinking about how can these ideas of resistance, how can this kind of transformation of space be moved to North America, be moved to Europe, be moved to, most recently, North Africa. So we know that there is lines of communication until, sadly, the Turkish invasion. In Rojava, in Chiapas, there was a lot of communication for how to organize the different municipal centers in Rojava, the Kurdish-controlled area in northern Syria. And there's rumors that Öcalan's next book will have a foreword by Subcomandante Galliano. So it's this notion of how do we put all this into dialogue to kind of keep transforming the space, but through what is really, at the heart of the day, kind of an institutional pedagogical project. You know, how do we work within these spaces to transform them from the inside out, to create resistant spaces, you know, that are kind of alive rather than these kind of dead simulations. And these are the things that I think methodologically we can look to, you know, in the humanities to think about how do we formulate our own resistance. You know, how do we start thinking about how we can set up different nodes of, you know, within a network, you know, to keep working in conversation and dialogue, to keep opening these spaces. Because if we fall into these kind of standardized systems, they're just traps. You know, so we have to think about how do we keep resisting this creatively. You know, and I do think a big part of that, you know, much like what they did in Mexico, right? If the Zapatistas stayed just Zapatista, if they were just an indigenous movement, if they were just a Mexican movement, the government would have crushed them in a second. You know, the way that they have existed and thrived is by opening up networks, you know, of solidarity internationally, and thinking about how this, as a methodological approach, works elsewhere. And that's what I think really the humanities needs to start doing, you know, explicitly thinking about this. How do we go into dialogue with each other to keep opening up these spaces of possibility? Thanks.